Next, we're going to consider another kind of minor issue, but it's an important one to kind of see about the next step we're going to make, because the next step we're going to talk about entry and exit of firms in response to profits and losses. So we're going to stop a second and address the issue of when firms should stop producing. Now, at first glance, the intuition would seem to suggest, first bullet point here, that if you're losing money, or in other words, if profit is negative, then you might say, well, that should be enough to stop producing. I mean, if you're losing money, you shouldn't produce a particular product. So once you're losing money, get out of business, one might think. Turns out that that's not quite completely right. It's not quite right. And we're going to see why in just a second. We're going to see in particular that firms that have fixed costs in production, and because of the shape of our average cost and marginal costs up above, we do have firms with fixed costs, that these firms will not automatically shut down just because they're losing money. Okay, and I'm going to explain to you why that's true in the next slide. Produce or not to produce? In the short run, what should a firm do? Now, let's imagine two different scenarios for an individual firm. First scenario, they choose to produce a particular product, and second scenario, they choose not to produce the product. First equation on the left-hand side here, profit. Profit if they produce. So the P here refers to production taking place. Well, profits are equal, standard definition we gave before, is total revenue minus total variable cost minus total fixed cost. And these two together, when added up, is going to be total costs of production. So we're just breaking up total costs into its two components. We've got the variable cost and the fixed cost, and we're subtracting both of those off in generating our total profit for the industry or for the firm. Okay, now, what would happen if the firm, though, chooses not to produce? Zero output, in other words. Okay, so this is profit when Q is equal to 0. And in this particular case, that profit is going to turn out to be equal to the negative of the total fixed costs. Because remember the definition of fixed costs. Fixed costs are those you must pay even if you drop your production level down to 0. Okay, so you still have to pay the fixed cost. You've got rent on the factory space that you're running, the offices, you're leasing space for your offices, and you have to pay that lease through the end of the year. You've got certain costs that just will not go away because you stop producing in a particular period. All right, and those are the total fixed costs that still have to be paid. All right, so, and in this particular case, we're imagining that the profits you would make if you produce are going to be the profit maximizing profit. So it's going to be the profits you would get if you were setting price equal to marginal cost and doing the best you possibly can in the marketplace, okay? So let's do a comparison. You're going to produce whenever the profits that you make when producing are going to be greater than the profits you make when you're not producing. All right, so let's plug in the values here. Profits when producing, total revenue minus total variable cost minus total fixed cost here. And that's got to be greater than the negative of the total fixed cost. You're going to lose money, in other words, if you don't produce. This is the amount minus TFC if you drop your output to 0. Okay, well, let's rearrange this, and let's note that regardless of what quantity you produce at, the fixed costs here are going to be exactly equal to the fixed costs over here. Those don't change with changes in quantity. So because in both the profits when you produce and the profits when you don't produce have this minus TFC in them, we can get rid of them. They're going to disappear. And that's going to leave us with this term, repeated here, which has to then be greater than 0 because I've gotten rid of the term on the left-hand side that's going to reduce to 0 here. Okay, so now we've got another condition. If total revenue minus total variable cost is greater than 0, it's going to make sense for the firm to produce. Okay, but let's take that and let's revise it just a little bit. Let's take the total revenue on the left-hand side. Actually, let's move it around. So let's move the minus TVC over to the other side to get this particular relationship, total revenue greater than total variable cost. But let's put it, since we're graphing everything in average terms per unit and relative to quantity, let's take total revenue divided by the quantity here. We're going to put a Q there. We're going to put a Q here, same Q in both instances, that should be the profit maximizing quantity ideally, then you're going to determine that TR over Q, which is equal to the price in this particular market, because total revenue is equal to price in the case of a perfectly competitive firm. Okay, and that's got to be greater than total variable cost divided by Q, which is the same as average variable cost. Okay, so this term becomes this one, this term becomes this one, and we have another relationship now. P greater than average variable cost is going to be the relationship that has to be true in order to induce production. If P is equal to average variable cost or less than average variable cost, then we're going to have a situation where it would make sense for the firm to shut down production. Okay, so stated briefly down here, the perfectly competitive or PC firm will produce whenever the price is greater. It's going to turn out to be then minimum average variable cost. Let's take a look at a graph. Okay, now here, let's look at individual firm 1, a representative firm. They've got an average cost curve and a marginal cost curve. But let's imagine that the average variable cost looks like this. Okay, now if the price in the market turns out to be at a price like this, for example, you're going to take that and the firm is going to decide to produce this particular quantity. And so if the price is P1, the quantity is going to be Q1 and so forth, right? But that price, at that price, is going to be greater than average variable cost. So at Q1, we've got prices greater than average variable cost. And so that's a condition that says you should produce in that particular circumstance. Right? Now, it so happens that the marginal cost is going to cross the average variable cost at the average variable cost minimum. All right? So if you take the price here, for example, P2, we're still going to be at a price that is above average variable cost right off there. And so in this particular case, P2 generating Q2 at Q2, again, price is still greater than average variable cost. All right, and that's going to continue to be true as long as the P is above minimum average variable cost, because that's where the marginal cost is going to cross the average variable cost. Has to be true. Now, once we get to a price that's lower, like here at P3, then at that price is lower than average variable cost, which is measured up here. And so regardless of what quantity a firm chooses at P3, it's going to be below average variable cost. So at P3, or at Q3, I should say, we're going to end up with prices less than average variable cost. And so P3 means don't produce. Drop your production to 0 instead. All right, so what does that get us? That gets us something like firm 2, which looks exactly like firm 1, of course. It's going to have a supply function that's going to be positive quantities here, here, here along the marginal cost curve, as long as that marginal cost curve lies above the average variable cost. But once the price falls below that, production is going to become 0. The firm is going to shut down completely. All right, and so that means if we take, this is actually what the supply curve is going to look like for a representative firm now. It's going to be the marginal cost curve at every price above minimum average variable cost, and it's going to be 0 at every price below minimum average variable cost. All right, so if we sum this up across the n firms to get the market supply curve, the market supply curve is actually going to look like this. It's going to be 0 for all prices that are too low, and then once we get to minimum average variable cost, it's going to come out to be the summation of the marginal cost curves. Now, I want to highlight something over here. At this price, P2, back on the first graph, and a quantity Q2, notice that because that price is below the average cost minimum, that price P2 is actually going to generate losses for the individual firm. The firm is going to lose money. So at P2, profits are less than 0. But at P2, which is like at a price like this here, firms are still going to supply something. They're still going to stay in business. They're still going to produce, even though they're losing money. Now we might ask, well, why would it make sense to stay in business if you're losing money? See if I got it. Why should firms stop producing? The reason firms stay in business even when losing money is because the cost of going out of business here is going to be higher due to the need to pay the fixed costs. So for example, let's say your fixed costs are, like I'll make up a number from our graph before, $200, all right? But let's say you're running the business and at the current price, you lose $100 in your production process. Well, that's your choice now. I could lose $100, lose money, or I could lose $200 and go out of business. Which is best for me? Turns out that losing $100 is profit maximizing because your next best alternative is losing even more money by going out of business. So firms will stay in business even though they're losing money for a period of time. Now, that won't happen or won't last forever. It is important to recognize or remember that fixed costs disappear often if enough time passes. And the good story about this is to remember that a lot of times fixed costs come about because you have a lease or a contract that you've entered into with another firm that's supplying something to you. So you might have a contract that says, I'm going to lease this office space for the next 2 years. And once you've signed that contract, well, you're stuck. You've got to make the monthly payments and you've got to pay for that. Even if you go out of business, the lessor, the person leasing the property, they're actually not going to care whether you're fulfilling your business or not fulfilling your business. You've signed a contract and you're obligated to make those monthly payments until the 2 years is up. All right, so you've got maybe 2 years where you've got to continue to pay these fixed costs. But eventually, when 2 years is up, you don't have to renew the contract and you don't have to continue to pay rent on that space and you can move out. In other words, then your fixed costs can disappear, and most of them likely will if you allow enough time to pass by. That allows you to get rid of equipment that you might not be using. So in time, you can eliminate those fixed costs, and once they're gone, well then, anytime you're losing money, you're going to get out of business. With no fixed costs, zero profit is the least you're going to tolerate. Anytime negative profits come about with no fixed costs, you're going to go out of business immediately. Okay, so this is getting us, again, sort of thinking hard about what the model is implying or telling us, gets us to some, at first, somewhat counterintuitive results, that a firm would stay in business even though it's making negative profit or losing money. Okay, and then we can see, by looking deeply at the assumptions that we've got incorporated here, we can come up with the intuition and an understanding for why that might actually come about. Okay, so that process is an important part of the process of understanding economic models and what it is we're trying to achieve with these particular models, how it gives us some insight about what happens in the world by looking more deeply at the assumptions that are necessary to generate these kinds of results or conclusions.